The envelope sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Garrett Finch opened it. He knew what it was. The return address said Whitmore Capital Group, and the logo, a clean serif font pressed into cream-colored paper, was the kind of thing designed to make you feel small before you even read the first line. He'd set it next to the fruit bowl behind the bananas, like if he didn't look directly at it, the decision inside wouldn't become real. His daughter, Phoebe, was 7. She noticed everything. "Dad, what's that letter?" "Just work stuff, Bug." "Is it important work stuff or boring work stuff?" He'd looked at her then, her hair still damp from the bath, her sock on one foot and barefoot on the other, the way she always lost one sock somewhere between the bathroom and the kitchen. And he'd said, "Important, very important." She'd nodded seriously, like she understood the weight of it, and then asked if they had any of the cheddar crackers left. That was the thing about being a single father. Life didn't pause for your big moments. The crackers still needed checking. The permission slip for the school trip still needed signing. The dentist appointment he'd rescheduled twice still needed booking. And somewhere in between all of that, Garrett Finch had built a construction technology company worth, according to the letter behind the bananas, enough to attract the interest of one of the most powerful private equity families in Ontario. He'd started Pinnacle Systems 6 years ago out of a rented office above a Vietnamese restaurant in Kitchener. He was 31 then, newly on his own with a 14-month-old daughter and a severance package from a mid-size engineering firm that had decided his department was redundant. The irony was that he'd spent 3 years building their site monitoring software, and they'd sold the licensing rights for 4 times what they'd paid him in total salary. He hadn't said anything when they walked him out. He'd driven home, picked up Phoebe from his sister Maureen's place, held her in the parking lot of a Sobeys for 20 minutes while she babbled about a pigeon she'd seen, and then driven home and started writing code. Pinnacle's software monitored structural integrity in real time, sensors embedded in concrete and steel that fed data to a central system, flagging risk before it became catastrophe. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of thing that made the tech press drool. But in an industry where a single oversight could kill someone, it turned out people were willing to pay for certainty. Within 2 years, Garrett had contracts with 3 municipal governments in Ontario. Within 4, his client list included projects in Alberta, British Columbia, and 2 American states. By the time Phoebe started grade 2, Pinnacle had 43 employees and had turned down 2 acquisition offers he'd considered too low. The Whitmore offer was not too low. He opened the envelope on the 4th morning, standing at the counter in his socks, Phoebe still asleep upstairs. The number made him set down his coffee. Not because it was beyond imagination, he'd run the valuations himself, he knew what the company was worth, but because seeing it written out, formal and final, made it real in a way spreadsheets never quite did. Whitmore Capital Group was old money. 3rd generation out of Toronto, with holdings across real estate, infrastructure, and resource extraction. The family patriarch, Reginald Whitmore, had died 4 years ago, and the empire now ran through his son, Clifford Whitmore, and Clifford's older sister, Bernadette Hale, who sat on the board. There was a younger brother, too, Prescott Whitmore, who showed up in the financial press occasionally, usually in the context of something that had gone slightly wrong. The family had the kind of name that opened rooms before you even knocked. Garrett called his lawyer, then his accountant, then his business partner, Leonard Chu, who drove over that evening with takeout from the Thai place on Weber Street and sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread out between them while Phoebe drew horses at the other end. "You're going to meet with them," Leonard said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to hear what they have to say." "That's the same thing. It's really not." Leonard looked at the number again. "Garrett, it's really is." They met at the Whitmore family's offices in downtown Toronto 3 weeks later. The building was on Bay Street, glass and limestone, the kind of architecture that communicated stability through sheer volume. Garrett had worn his best suit, charcoal gray, bought 2 years ago for a keynote he'd given at a construction industry conference in Calgary. He'd had it pressed. He'd shined his shoes. He'd left Kitchener at 5 in the morning to avoid traffic and arrived 40 minutes early, which meant he sat in a coffee shop around the corner, reading the same paragraph of a construction trade report 4 times. He thought about Phoebe, who had given him a drawing to put in his pocket that morning. She'd drawn Pinnacle's logo. She'd seen it enough times to reproduce it roughly, with a star above it and the words, "Go Dad," in blocky letters underneath. He'd folded it carefully and put it in his inside breast pocket, where it now sat pressed against his chest. The meeting room was on the 19th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the lake on a gray February morning, a table long enough to seat 20 with only 6 chairs occupied. Clifford Whitmore sat at the head, late 50s, silver hair, the easy authority of a man who had never not been the most powerful person in a room. His sister Bernadette was beside him, sharper looking, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair. The legal team flanked them. And at the far end, almost as an afterthought, Prescott Whitmore slouched in his chair with the particular posture of someone who had walked into rooms like this so many times he'd stopped noticing them. Garrett sat across from them with Leonard and their lawyer, Diane Osei. He'd worked with Diane for 3 years. She had the kind of calm that didn't read as warmth but as precision, which was what you wanted in a room like this. The first hour was procedural. Numbers, timelines, the structure of the proposed acquisition. Whitmore Capital wanted a full buyout, with Garrett staying on as CEO for a minimum of 2 years post-acquisition to ensure operational continuity. His team would be retained. The IP would transfer to the parent company. It was, on paper, a generous offer. Garrett asked questions. Diane asked more. Leonard sat quiet and listened, which was what Leonard did best. Then the second hour began, and something shifted. It started small. Clifford Whitmore, leaning back in his chair, mentioned almost in passing that the family had done their due diligence on Pinnacle, the standard phrase, nothing unusual, and then added that they'd also done their due diligence on key personnel. He said it with a particular flatness that was not quite neutral. Of course, Garrett said. We were somewhat surprised, Clifford continued, by certain aspects of the operational picture. A company of this scale, running with a leadership structure as lean as yours. One wonders about long-term stability. Garrett looked at him. Lean is how we kept margins where they are. Clifford picked up his pen, set it down. And the personal circumstances. Managing a company at this stage of growth while also managing, well, we understand you're a single parent. The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Garrett said, I am a young child, I understand. She's 7. Bernadette, who had been making notes, looked up. Clifford tilted his head in almost sympathetic gesture. It's not our intention to pry, but we're investing at a significant level, and part of what we're investing in is leadership continuity. We need to understand any factors that might compromise focus. Garrett felt something in his jaw tighten, and he made a deliberate choice to let it. Not to push it down, not to smooth it over, just to let it sit there while he listened to the rest. We had a situation, Prescott said from the end of the table, his first words of the meeting, with an investment a few years back, founder with young children. Took his eye off the ball during a critical phase. Cost us considerably. That's a coincidence, Garrett said, not a data point. Prescott shrugged. We see it differently. There was a brief silence. Then Clifford set both hands flat on the table, a gesture of apparent reason. We're simply saying that a company at this stage, with the kind of integration we're proposing, requires a CEO whose personal life is structured in a way that supports full commitment. We'd want assurances. Formal assurances. A framework that ensures prioritization. Garrett looked across the table. He understood now exactly what was happening. This was a pressure move. This was what old money did when it wanted a better deal. It found the place where it thought you were soft, and it pushed there. They'd decided that his daughter was his soft place. They weren't entirely wrong. She was. She was the softest place in his entire life. She was the reason he'd started the company, the reason he'd worked 12-hour days and still made it home for dinner. 4 nights out of 5, the reason Pinnacle existed at all. But what the Whitmores had miscalculated, and it was a significant miscalculation, was that soft and weak were not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Diane had set her pen down. Leonard was looking at the window. I want to make sure I understand what you're proposing, Garrett said. His voice was even. You want formal documentation, contractual assurance, that my parenting will not interfere with my professional duties. Clifford spread his hands. We want to structure things in a way that protects the investment. My daughter, Garrett said, has never cost this company a single deadline, a single client, or a single dollar. I built Pinnacle while raising her alone from 14 months old. Every milestone this company has hit, she has been in the next room, or in the back seat, or sitting in a waiting room at a city planning office while I presented to municipal engineers. He paused. I would not describe that as a liability. I would describe that as the reason my executive functioning is better than most people in this industry, because I have not had the luxury of being careless with my time. Nobody spoke. Garrett continued, what you're describing, the assurances, the framework, what you're actually asking is for me to sign a document that implies I'm a lesser CEO because I'm a father. I'm not going to do that. Clifford opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Garrett said, not loudly, just clearly. I've read your acquisition history. I know what Whitmore Capital does with companies after 2 years of operational continuity. You fold the IP into the parent structure and you restructure the team. That's not a criticism, it's a business model. But the people you'd be restructuring are people who have worked beside me for 6 years, some of them since the beginning. I told myself I'd consider a deal that protected them. I have not seen that deal today. He reached over and closed the folder in front of him. I think we're done, he said. Bernadette sat very still. Clifford said sharply, You're walking away from the terms on the table. Yes, do you understand what you're walking away from? I do, Garrett said. You thought I didn't, but I do. He stood. Leonard stood a half-second later. Diane was already gathering her documents with the calm of someone who had been prepared for exactly this outcome. They rode the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, Leonard let out a long breath. You okay? Leonard said. Yeah. Garrett stood on the gray February sidewalk outside a Bay Street tower and put his hand in his inside pocket against the paper there. Yeah, I'm okay. He called Maureen from the car on the drive back. She listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was unusual for her. They questioned your parenting, she said when he finished. They questioned my focus. Those aren't different things, Garrett. No, he said, they're not. He picked Phoebe up from school at 3:15. She came out holding a paper crown she'd made in art class, orange and yellow, and decorated with her name in glitter glue that had dried crooked. She put it on his head before he could say anything. How was the meeting? She asked, climbing into the back seat with the confidence of someone who had been asking this question for years and expected a real answer. It didn't go the way they expected. Did it go the way you expected? He looked at her in the rearview mirror. Pretty much, yeah. She accepted this and looked out the window. Can we get Rhodey? Absolutely. He didn't think about Whitmore Capital again until a week later, when Diane called to say she'd heard from their legal team. Clifford had apparently been surprised, genuinely surprised, by the walkout. There had been some internal conversation about whether to revise the terms. Diane relayed this without editorial comment, which was her way of letting him decide how to feel about it. Tell them thank you, Garrett said. The answer is still no. He was not sitting still in the meantime. He'd had conversations with 2 other potential partners already. Conversations he'd been having quietly for months, because he had always known there was more than one room with a table in it. One of those conversations was with a Calgary-based infrastructure fund that had been watching Pinnacle's municipal contracts with considerable interest. The other was with a European construction group expanding into North America that wanted technology partnerships rather than acquisitions. The infrastructure fund moved fast. Within 6 weeks of the Bay Street meeting, Garrett had signed a partnership agreement that gave Pinnacle a capital injection without surrendering ownership, structured around performance milestones his team had helped design. The terms were clean. His people were protected. There was no clause about his personal life. The construction industry press ran a short piece when the partnership was announced. It focused on Pinnacle's contract growth and the infrastructure fund's North American strategy. Garrett was quoted once briefly about his approach to structural monitoring technology. The piece did not mention Whitmore Capital. The piece did not mention Phoebe, but he told Phoebe about it that night at dinner. He told her the whole thing, or the version of it that a 7-year-old could hold. That some people at a meeting had tried to suggest that having a daughter made him bad at his job. That he'd told them they were wrong. That he'd walked away. That something better had come from it. She listened with her fork halfway to her mouth, the way she listened when she was actually processing something. Were they being mean? She asked. They were being careless. They didn't think about what they were saying. Did you tell them it was mean? I told them it wasn't true. She considered this. That's better, she decided. Because telling someone they're being mean, they just get defensive. But if you tell them they're wrong, then they have to actually think about it. He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, crown she'd made in art class still on the corner of the counter because she'd refused to let it be thrown away, and he thought about the elevator, and the sidewalk, and the paper in his pocket, and the 2 years he'd spent making decisions at a kitchen table while she did homework at the other end. Where did you learn that? He said. She shrugged. From you. The spring came early that year, the way Canadian springs sometimes do after a hard winter. Tentative at first, then all at once, lilacs coming up before anyone expected them. Garrett ran the Pinnacle team expansion meeting in April, bringing in 4 new engineers, 2 of them women who'd been working in infrastructure for a decade and had been looking, as one of them put it, for somewhere that treated structural safety like it actually mattered. The new partnership meant new contracts. The new contracts meant new hiring. Leonard, who had never been easily impressed, came into Garrett's office in May with a projection sheet that he set on the desk without comment and just pointed at. Garrett looked at the number. He said. Yeah, said Leonard. It was considerably more than what Whitmore Capital had offered for the whole company. He heard about Whitmore Capital again in June from an industry contact at a construction conference in Hamilton. Clifford's group had made another acquisition attempt, a smaller tech firm, different sector, and it had gone sideways apparently, something to do with post-acquisition restructuring that had triggered a key person clause and a messy legal dispute. Garrett's contact mentioned it the way people mention things they assume you already know, not realizing he hadn't been following it. Tough year for them, his contact said. Sounds like it, Garrett said. He didn't feel satisfaction exactly. He felt something quieter and more solid than that. The feeling of having known, before the outcome confirmed it, that the ground he was standing on was real. Phoebe's spring concert was in the third week of June. She was in the choir, in the second row, wearing a white shirt that they'd ironed together that morning because Garrett had forgotten to do it the night before, and they'd both stood over the ironing board at 7 a.m., trying to get the collar right, laughing at the steam going sideways. She'd found the ironing hilarious for reasons he couldn't entirely explain. He sat in the third row of the school gymnasium with parents on either side of him, the folding chairs slightly too small, the acoustic tile ceiling giving everything an echo. When she sang, he could pick her voice out of the full choir, even though he would have been hard-pressed to explain how. Not that she was loudest, or that she sang differently, just that the ear finds what it's been listening for. At the end, when the children filed out from the risers to find their families, she walked straight to him with the focused intention of a person who had already identified the exact coordinates of where they needed to be. She hugged him around the waist, and he put his hand on the back of her head, and for a moment the gymnasium noise went soft around them. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "Every word," he said. She looked up. "I sang the high part. I know. You nailed it." She grinned the grin she got when she was pleased, but trying not to show it too much. Then she looked at his jacket pocket and said, "Is the drawing still in there?" He reached in. The paper was soft now at the folds, worn from being put in and taken out over the weeks since the Bay Street morning. He unfolded it carefully on his palm, the Pinnacle logo, slightly smudged, the star, the blocky "Go Dad." "Still there," he said. She smoothed it with one finger, satisfied. "Good," she said. "You might need it again." He folded it back, put it back in his pocket, and they walked out of the gymnasium together into a June evening that was warm and soft and smelled like cut grass and someone nearby barbecuing down the street. The kind of evening that happened all over Canada in June, and was so ordinary and so good that it was easy, if you weren't paying attention, to walk right through it without noticing. Garrett Finch was paying attention. He had always been paying attention. That, in the end, was the whole point.